we dive into our first Acrolinx presentation, will be held by PG, our Senior Vice President Product Marketing. And he gets some support from James Longbottom, our project consultant and linguistic engineer at Acrolinx. And their presentation is titled Strategy, Implementation and Usage of Acrolinx New Voice Feature.
Thank you, Ina. And in fact, and hello everyone. In fact, I will be supporting James, who will be doing the bulk of this presentation, but I'm going to start out with a story about why we developed the voice feature in the first place. And this is only one of several stories, but I want you to know, I think this is a good starting point. So we had a customer approach us last year. And they told us that they had conducted an experiment where they took their content and their competitors' content, they removed all the identifying information, and then they put that content side by side, put it in front of their colleagues, and asked them whose content was whose. And it won't surprise you to know that no one could tell the difference. Now, you may ask, so what difference does that make? And their conclusion was that it was hurting their business. And the reason it was hurting their business is because their content was undifferentiated, even though they sold on the basis of superior products with superior service. But the content looked the same. And the reason that was a problem is because increasingly buyers buy technology or buy products based on content. You can see the Forrester Research quote here, buyers complete from 2/3 to 90% of their buying process before they ever speak with a vendor. And so what happens in the meantime? How do you build relationships with customers if you're not talking to them? And the answer is you're building those relationships through their content. And so this customer said, because we're building relationships through content and because our content is not differentiated in any way, our products aren't differentiated. We're at serious risk of losing business. In fact, we think we already are losing business. And so they implemented a project to change their tone of voice, because it was voice. It was the tone of voice that their content used that represented the opportunity for them to change their content and differentiate it. And it's not just marketing content. Technical content is important to buyers as well. In fact, this IBM survey indicates that for almost 89% of buyers, high-quality content is important or very important to their initial purchase decision. And we've seen other surveys, too, that indicate that technical content is critical to the buying process, not just to owning the product. And Andrew quoted Doug Kessler earlier in his introduction. I want to read you a quote. In fact, I've excerpted the quote here on the screen, but I want to read you the full quote from Doug about why tone of voice matters. He says, tone of voice isn't just decoration for your ideas. It actually carries meaning. It says things about your topic, and more importantly, it says things about you, the speaker. Get it wrong, and you'll lose your audience before they ever really become your audience. Get it really wrong, and your audience will stick around just so they can hate you. But get it right, and you'll make your message 10 times, maybe even 100 times more convincing. And I'm not being metaphorical here, he says. I'm being literal. So Andrew showed you the formula earlier of content times voice equals impact. This is Doug providing some initial argument for why he believes that tone of voice matters. And I think most of you would say that tone of voice matters. We're starting to hear from lots of our customers that tone of voice matters. EasyJet's not a customer, but you can see how they've characterized their tone of voice. They say the same thing in 3 different ways, which is don't overcomplicate, be direct and get to the point, always look for the simplest way to say what you want. That seems like 1 thing, not 3, so maybe they have overcomplicated it, but at least you see that they're really trying to drive home the point that you need to keep it simple. I love this quote from Microsoft in a blog posting that they did last year, where they say destroy all robot language. And you can see the examples they give of words they used to use and words that they now recommend that their writers use. So they might have said purchase, now they say buy. Instead of navigate, they say go. And we're talking to lots of companies who are saying, we now recognize that our tone of voice makes a difference. It communicates about who we are. It tells the market what kind of a company we are to work with. And so we decided it wasn't enough for us just to support style, but that we needed to actually help our customers measure the voice in their content. And so we introduced in the Acrolinx 4.x release, which came out at the, or 4.0 release, which came out at the start of the year, we introduced these measurements of voice. And the whole principle behind it is to help our customers create content that's more engaging to the audience. And so you can see here an excerpt from the scorecard. It shows how the writer has, how the content works against the target. So the target for each of these voice scores is the middle of the green range, and the actual score is represented by the triangles. Now you may say, well, where do those targets come from? Someone with proper authority can set the target in the dashboard, so and manipulate the sliders. And James will show you exactly how you go about doing that when he demonstrates all of this. Now let's talk about how scores work. I want to emphasize that a score of 100, that is a score that's on the far right side, is not necessarily the best. It's merely the highest. So your target score can vary based on your audience, based on the type of content, based on where that content falls, say, in the customer life cycle. And it also needs to reflect your brand personality. What are you aiming for in terms of readability or informality or liveliness? And you may want your content to vary in terms, say, of informality based on content types, such as technical content may be less formal, or maybe more formal, I mean, the marketing content. Now, we're certainly going to get into a conversation about where do these scores come from, and in fact, we do have the possibility, at least in the software, of adjusting how we calculate the score. But our recommendation is, rather than adjusting the score, adjusting the targets. So we have out-of-the-box calculations for these scores in English. There are similar scores available now in German. And instead of adjusting the scoring itself, we recommend you adjust your target. And so I'm almost finished here before I turn it over to James, but I want to give you actual before and after data that we, or before and after analysis that we did for one of our customers. They gave us content that they had they had originally. They improved that content, and we measured it both before and after. And you can see the, well, you can't see, but before is on the left, the improved content is on the right, and you can see a pretty dramatic difference in most cases, improvement in readability across various content types. And you'll see similar types of improvements in informality and finally in liveliness. So as one of my colleagues said when I showed this to her, wow, this stuff really works. So it does in fact measure the kind of improvements that people are looking for in their tone of voice. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, James Longbotham. James, let me make you presenter. And James is going to talk to you about where the voice scores come from and take you through a demonstration. James?
All right, great. Thank you, Peachy. And we'll go through a couple slides first to talk about what exactly it is that Acrolinx is measuring when it looks at these three different categories. So you might have seen on the previous slides, those three categories are readability, informality, and liveliness. So we'll look first at what does that mean for Acrolinx. What's readable, what's informal, and what's lively? So first, readability. What exactly is being measured? One main thing that you can probably also imagine is that Acrolinx is looking for active voice versus passive voice. So active voice is generally much more direct, much clearer, makes it more explicit who is really doing what, and is often easier to understand and read. It also means that you're not maybe leaving out important information that you can with passive constructions. Another feature that Acrolinx looks at is sentence length. This also is fairly obvious. Longer sentences are more likely to be complex and more likely to be difficult to understand. So the longer the sentence becomes, the more difficult it is to read. Along those lines, Acrolinx also looks for specifically complex sentences like embedded sentences. If you're not sure what that means, here is an example on the screen. I'll go ahead and read it out. That is, check for errors in the logging window that appears after you restart the server that was terminated unexpectedly. So you can tell that there are two relative clauses embedded into this sentence, starting with that appears and that was terminated. And that can also make the sentence a bit difficult to understand. It might be better to split it up into a few sentences so that it's clearer. So also on the word level, Acrolinx looks for complex words. So this doesn't necessarily mean long words, although they are often also long, but specifically words that are somehow more complex versions of ordinary words. So here are two sentences that mean the same thing. One is using very complex words, and one is using very easy words. The first one is recurring diagnostic procedures facilitate efficient utilization of server resources. So that sounds very impressive, but for a lot of people that might not really be understandable. Instead, what you could say is regular health checks help you to use your server resources more efficiently. That's much clearer and easier to understand. There are a few other factors that affect readability that we won't get into now, but here you get a good idea of the kinds of things that Acrolinx is looking for. So now let's look at informality and what's measured here. Informality has all to do with using natural and common language and being approachable and friendly. So there are a few things that Acrolinx looks for specifically for informality. One is just using pronouns. Things like you, we, and I especially are ways to get readers involved in your content, to address them specifically and directly, and that makes the content friendlier, more approachable, less distant. Another feature that Acrolinx looks for is contractions. So that also makes sense. Contractions are very common in speech, and more formal language generally doesn't use contractions. So here's an example of a text with contractions. You can tell it has a sort of more informal tone about it. If you've got a problem with your installation, don't hesitate to contact us. We're ready for your call. And another feature that Acrolinx looks for is discourse markers. This also is just a way that you can sort of mimic spoken language in your content by using words like now at the beginning of a sentence, like you might when you're talking. Now, if you look at how the industry is changing, you'll notice a few interesting trends. And there are a few other factors for informality as well, but here you get a good idea of what Acrolinx is looking for. The third category that Acrolinx measures is liveliness. Now this, you might wonder, what's the difference between liveliness and informality? Well, informality really has to do with being approachable and friendly. Liveliness is all about being interesting, exciting, inspiring, writing in a way that makes people want to hear more. And the way you can do that is to do things like write incomplete sentences sometimes. That makes the language or the rhythm of the content that you're writing a bit more interesting, more exciting. It breaks it up instead of it being monotone. Another thing that you can do is write short sentences. Short sentences generally have a punchier feel to them and have somewhat more power. So here's an example of one sentence written as one long sentence and then split into three. We have, when processes work efficiently, customers get results, and employees are more productive, both of which are beneficial for business. If you want to be a little bit more lively, you could write, when your processes work efficiently, everyone benefits. Customers get results, employees are more productive. So you can tell there's a more interesting rhythm there when you write those shorter sentences. Like readability and to a certain extent informality, liveliness is also affected by active voice versus passive voice. Passive voice really does make content less lively, so active voice is something Acrolinx would be looking for. And another thing that Acrolinx looks for is the use of cliches or overused expressions. These are, in fact, things that you would want to avoid if you want to be lively. This might seem counterintuitive at first. You might think that to be lively, you want to use sort of common expressions that people are familiar with, but in fact, liveliness is also all about originality. So you want to avoid these kinds of words or phrases that everyone's heard before, because that makes your content less original. And beyond that, there are a few other things that also affect liveliness, but here again you have an idea of what Acrolinx is looking for. All right, so let's see what this looks like in action. So I'm going to show you first what you can do as an administrator in the dashboard, what you can do to set up the voice scores for your organization. So you can see here I'm logged into the dashboard. I'm over in Resources, Configure Voice Scores. So this is where you can do everything you need to make voice scores set up correctly for your content. You'll notice I'm using the latest server version, so I have voice scores available for German and English. We're going to just look at English for now. What you can see here in the general settings is those three categories that we just talked about: readability, informality, and liveliness. The first thing that you might notice is that you have the option to disable a category. So let's say in your type of content, informality is not a priority. That's something that you can unselect here, and it won't show up anymore for authors when they run a check. We'll see in a second what that scorecard looks like. I'm going to leave it enabled now, though, so we can see what it looks like. Another option you have here for configuration is actually changing what these characteristics or these categories are called. By default, they're called readability, informality, liveliness. But in our experience, a lot of organizations have guidelines about tone of voice, and they use different words to describe very similar types of characteristics. So instead of readability, for you it might be all about clarity, writing clear content, or understandability. For us, that would be very similar to readability, and in fact you could just then change the display name. Similarly with informality, you might instead say friendliness or approachability, and instead of liveliness you might say inspiring or bold, something along those lines. So that's another way that you can customize these voice scores in a very easy way to match what your guidelines are. You'll notice as well there's a special section called word lists. Right now this contains a word list that affects the liveliness score. So these are unsuitable words for liveliness, and if we open that, what you see is that these are those cliches and overused expressions that I mentioned that would hurt a liveliness score. So these are things like bandwidth, which can be a bit jargony, or bang for your buck, bark up the wrong tree, all these kinds of cliches or overused expressions that you might want to avoid. The thing about this list is you can freely add to it, so it's completely editable, and you can delete words or phrases from it. So you might say, well, bandwidth for us, we actually generally use that to mean actual bandwidth. We don't really use it in a jargony way. So you could then just delete it from the list, and it won't affect your liveliness score anymore. The other area that you can customize these voice scores is the actual target score. So as PG mentioned, for these voice scores, 100 does not mean the best. 100 means it's very much one of these categories, but for your content, you might want to be rather somewhere in the middle. I think for readability, it makes sense to be on the higher end always, but for something like informality or liveliness, especially if you're writing very sort of sober documentation that needs to be straight to the point, you might want this to be more in the middle of the range. And if you're writing marketing content that needs to be engaging and interesting and exciting, it can be at the higher end. So you might be wondering, well, how do I know exactly what range makes sense for my content, for what we want to do? The way that you can find that out is by really calibrating. So the idea is that you can, on your side, identify examples of content that for you have the right level of readability or informality or liveliness, and then you can run checks on those and see what the scores come out as. I would suggest doing that, of course, not just with 1 or 2 pieces of content, but as many as you can, so that you can really see, for your ideal content, what is the score that Acrolinx gives. And based on that, you can determine what your target is. You might also be considering that for different types of content, you would actually have different targets. And that's definitely true. For something like I said, more sober documentation that needs to be straight to the point, you might have a lower liveliness score. For marketing, you would have maybe a higher liveliness score. So what you can do is set up different target sets for that different content. I should mention, though, one prerequisite for using these target sets is using checking profiles. So we aren't going to get into checking profiles in this session, but that is a way that you can centrally configure settings for end users. Things like, are they checking for spelling, grammar, or style? What term sets are they being used to check? Are they using to check with? And what voice target sets are they using? So that's how you can then specify for what users what target set they would be using. All right, so that's how you can set up voice scores as an administrator. But let's take a look now at what it's like actually for authors to use voice scores. So I have here an example file. This is one that has somewhat poor readability. You'll notice as we go through it, it's somewhat jargony. So let's take a look at what Acrolinx gives as the score to begin with. We'll look at the feedback that writers get, the guidelines that they see, and based on that, we'll make some changes and see how that affects the score. So I'm just going to connect to the server. All right, and I will run the check. If you don't have the version 4.0 of Acrolinx yet, this will be new to you. This is the scorecard that shows up. And you'll notice one section down here beneath the feedback on spelling, grammar, and style is for voice. So here you can see the range of the voice score, and in green you can see what the target is as set in the dashboard. So if you'll remember, our target was 80 for readability and 60 for informality and liveliness. And you'll notice for this document, readability and liveliness are both in the red, informality is in the yellow. So there's definitely room for improvement. All of these scores are down in the 20s. So what you can do then as a writer is you can jump to these sections on the voice scores, and you can read the guidelines provided directly in the scorecard. So here's the section on readability. You can see there's a guideline that says use active voice, an explanation, use a simple sentence structure, shorten your average sentence length, use fewer embedded sentences, use fewer complex words, and remove noun clusters. So those are all guidelines that will help improve a readability score. You have the same section further down on informality and then liveliness. Let's concentrate for now on readability, and we'll see that by improving readability, we will probably also help improve some of the other scores. All right, so let's take a look at this document in a bit more detail. You'll see it's just 2 sentences, both fairly long. So the first thing you can think of is let's make these sentences shorter. For this first one, we have smart tech is a global leader in open standards-based unified communications and collaboration UC&C solutions. All right, let's stop there. That's already quite a mouthful and probably something that we can simplify and shorten. So one thing is this section here, it's a global leader in open standards-based unified communications and collaboration systems. So that's probably great, but the point here is all about these solutions. So instead of saying that it's a global leader in these solutions, which is good, it's a bit jargony though, we can make it simpler by just saying that Smart Tech delivers these solutions. One thing that we probably want to keep is this unified communications and collaboration, because it refers also then to this abbreviation. So it might be something that people are searching for. So let's keep that exact wording. But if we keep going, we'll notice the word collaboration comes up again. We probably don't need to mention that twice. So far we have Smart Tech delivers unified communications and collaboration solutions for voice and video. All right, sounds good so far. Trusted by more than 300,000 customers around the world. So that's great that it's trusted by them, but we're actually talking about delivering. So instead of trusted by, let's just say we deliver to the customers. And instead of more than, we can even make that simpler and say over 300,000 customers. So now I'm pretty satisfied with this. It's much shorter, much more to the point, and we've gotten rid of some of that jargony language. If we skip down to this next sentence, we have Smart Tech solutions are powered by the Smart Tech real-life platform. So here you probably noticed immediately there's a passive voice. So that's something that definitely we should get rid of. So instead of saying that the Smart Tech solutions are powered by this platform, we can instead say that this platform is the foundation. And instead of referring to Smart Tech again, we can actually just refer to ourselves. So one option would be to say the foundation of our solutions is the Smart Tech real-life platform. So that's also something that we've got rid of the passive voice. We've made it somewhat more approachable by using our instead of Smart Tech again. All right, so then we get to here, comprehensive software infrastructure and rich APIs that interoperate with the broadest set of communication, business, mobile, and cloud applications and devices. So once again, woo, that sounds impressive. It's a bit jargony though, and it's a bit of a mouthful, and I'm not sure that I really got all of that. So instead, let's also make that somewhat simpler. Instead of talking about the details of this, where we actually list out exactly what these applications and devices are, we can say simply that it supports many communication, business, mobile, and cloud applications and devices. Let's go ahead and start a new sentence. That seems like a good place to stop. And we're talking about Smart Tech again, so Smart Tech delivers secure face-to-face video collaboration in any environment. Here, in any environment, that sounds a bit technical as well. So let's say instead for all types of applications. All right, so then we can rerun this check and see what happened then to our scores. So you'll notice there's a huge jump there in readability from the 20s now up to 82, so firmly in the green zone. For informality, we also improved that score from the 20s now to 43. Not that high, but remember our target was 60, so it's in that green range, probably because we got rid of passive voice and we used the pronoun our. Liveliness didn't increase that much, but now instead of being in the red, it's at least in the yellow. So that's how writers or authors can also make these changes by looking at the help that you have in the scorecard, and based on that, reviewing the document, reviewing the content, and seeing what they can do to improve these different scores, or at least to get these scores into the range where they're supposed to be. All right, so that is all from my side for the demo. I think it makes sense then to move on and see if there are any questions.
We have a question as well. Could Acrolinx implement a rule to flag complex sentences, such as the embedded sentence example from James with multiple relative pronouns, and suggest to rewrite as the two sentences? Current Acrolinx rule advice is focused on rewriting within a single sentence.
Yes, so that is a very good question. I mentioned that these voice scores measure phenomena in the content, and that writers get the help from the scorecard. Another thing that can help, of course, is also style rules. There are style rules for things like passive voice. There is one that we've developed in the past for embedded sentences, where Acrolinx identifies these embedded sentences and flags them. I don't think there would be a very good way for Acrolinx to automatically suggest the rewrite for the embedded sentence, but it then really comes down to what the help for that looks like. So the help that you give authors for embedded sentences could be, instead of just rewrite this one sentence, consider breaking it up into more than one sentence. So that would be an option. But it's definitely the case that style rules can be used to give more direct and specific feedback about these different criteria for authors.
Okay, thanks, James. Another question is, it's saying question for this example, does Acrolinx also provide examples of who to rephrase for a better voice?
Acrolinx does provide examples, so let me just open that scorecard again. So if we go down to the section on readability, for example, for each of these guidelines you do get examples of what you can do to improve sentences by using active voice or simplifying sentence structure, not using embedded sentences. Those are all examples that they give in the scorecard.
Here's a specification of this question, not general examples, but specific examples for the particular text.
So there isn't any specific example for the text that you've just checked, for example. That's one thing about voice, is that the feedback that you get about exactly what you wrote is the score. For now, we are looking into ways to make it more directly related to what you wrote, where we maybe point out the areas where you have used passive voice or where sentences are too complex, but that's still under consideration.
You know, I have a question here you may not have seen. Got asked, when will voice checking be available for German?
Good question. So you might have seen in the dashboard I had the option here for German. That's because I'm using the latest version of Acrolinx, which is Server 4.1. So German voice scores will be available with Server 4.1.
And 4.1 is available now.
We go to the next question. James, can Acrolinx highlight which words and phrases are problematic?
So Acrolinx can do that right now through style rules. Like I mentioned, if you have things like passive voice and you have the rule avoid passive voice, that specific style rule, then that will flag it. But for some of these types of things that the voice scores are measuring, it doesn't really make sense to flag it. It makes more sense just to measure it, but in many cases there is then an overlap between style rules and the voice scores.
Okay, thanks, James. What is the correlation between the style rules set and the voice scores?
So the voice scores are the same for everyone right now. So all the criteria that the voice scores measure are the same. It's not something that we have customized so far at an individual organization level, but your style rules are generally customized. So you probably have many style rules that other users of Acrolinx don't have. So exactly what the correlation is depends on what style rules you use. So if you have a style rule like avoid embedded sentences, then there's that correlation. If you have rules about avoiding passive voice, then that's the correlation. But that really just depends on what style rules you use.
What are the possibilities to adjust the factors for the voice checker?
All right, so that is a good question. That isn't something that we have done so far. It is theoretically possible to change exactly what it is that Acrolinx is measuring, but probably the better way to go about it, instead of changing what the score is that you get for certain content, to adjust what the target is that you want. So one case that has come up in the past, if we look at informality, for example, is that in informality it says if you want to make your content more informal, use contractions. So that is something that you might say, wait, but this conflicts with our style rule, avoid contractions. That's true, but you should understand that informality, if you use contractions, it makes your content more informal. So if you want people to avoid using contractions, then your target score for informality should be lower as well. And you should also communicate to authors that style rules are what they should be following, and something like the informality score is something where they don't want to be too high, they want to be somewhere in the middle, and avoiding contractions is still part of what they should be doing. So some of it has to do with finding out what target makes sense for you, and another part is communicating clearly to authors how to work with these voice scores and exactly what they should do to get the right level of informality, liveliness, or readability.
Okay, thanks, James. Is there a possibility in the dashboard to completely remove the voice function from the checker if one thinks that it might confuse the users?
In the dashboard, you can disable each of the categories, which means that they won't be displayed anymore in a scorecard. It might be the case, though, that you still see some traces of the voice checking in the scorecard, maybe a label. If you want to completely remove it, that's something that can be changed in a properties file on the server. But at any time in the dashboard, you can disable the different categories.
Okay, thanks you. James, thanks, and Peachy, thank you as well for your good presentation.